Well, joining me now is Kristen Soltis Anderson, Echelon Insights, right, Kristen? Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, that is. I've known her, I want to say 15 years, 20 years maybe now.
Yes.
You got your start with an old friend of mine named David Winston, a longtime Republican pollster. David Winston and I, you may now know this only by story, we were the first people to put polling on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
There was no Real Clear Politics. There was no Nate Silver. There was me and David Winston in politics now. So you come from good. You come from a good lineage of good people on that front. One of the smarter
Well,
pollsters I've learned
David
from over
used
the
to
years.
tell me, David used to tell me that you all would occasionally get emails from a young student at the University of Pennsylvania named Patrick Ruffini, who was really interested in politics. And so he has now been my business partner for the last 11 years. So it really all has come full circle.
Well, and you bring up, I love Patrick's Substack. I tell him that I think it's a terrific, that weekly, especially he was doing that weekly newsletter for a while. And I know now he's
Yeah.
turned it more into a Substack where, it's sort of like, hey, check out what I found this week. This is an interesting piece of data, which is why I'm excited to have you on. We are taping. I want to timestamp this a little bit. We're taping at the end of June, June 20 on a Friday, June 27th. And we just got, it was Christmas for Stata Geeks this week because Pew came out with its describe what Pew did. They call it a voter validation survey of sorts, but what it really is it takes an exit poll and makes it more accurate is probably the quick way I'd explain it. But how would you explain it?
Yeah, a voter validation process basically says, you can do a survey where you're talking to folks who are registered voters. They are people who exist on the voter file, but that's not necessarily the same as people who actually voted. So the great thing about the voter file is after an election, it tells you who turned out. And so you can go back and see of somebody who said, yes, I turned out in the 2024 election. We now can know if that's true or not. In Pew's case, I believe they used a couple different vendors. I don't think they named them, but if you work in this space, you can kind of read between the lines. Right. I'm guessing one is either Data Trust or i360 because those are it said one vendor worked with conservatives, one vendor works with progressives. So I'm like, is that Catalyst? I'm less familiar with the ecosystem on that side. And then one is nonpartisan, which I'm assuming is L2. We use L2 a lot at my company. So anyhow, I'm like, it's funny going through and trying to figure out where they got these lists. Anyhow, the point is they go through and they figure out not just people who claim they voted, but people where there is proof that you actually voted in 2024. And that can give you
and they match
confidence.
it to their old data, right? Like they basically go back. These are interviews they conducted throughout the 2024 campaign. Then they actually said, okay, these people called themselves likely voters. And what I love about it is that it gives you both a clear picture of who voted, but it also is the single best survey that we get of non-voters and understanding what is the makeup of the people who did not vote. Because, obviously, if you figure out how to get some of them to vote, you can change an electorate. But it frustrates me to all end. And I have this fight. I used to have this fight with my own pollsters. I want to spend more time understanding the non-voter. I think sometimes we don't fully appreciate it. And I think it's a gap sometimes in political survey research, particularly on the media side of things. So this is why I said it was like Christmas this week. I've been going through this data. I'm sure you have as well. And so just fair warning, we may geek out a little bit here. But before we get to the 2024 vote, I do want to because we haven't had great data on sort of how the public is taking the Iran strikes. So, look, I am a YouGov skeptic. It's not my favorite. They're not my favorite methodology. I'm not, but it is ubiquitous and they do have giant samples, and a giant sample can sometimes overcome mediocre methodology. So I feel like that's been the most data I've seen is on that. And it is interesting to me that there is some overall skepticism that this is going to be long-term effective. That's the big takeaway I took, is that voters really do have an Iraq hangover in how they're looking at this?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to go into the field right before the
Mm,
attack on Fordo and the other nuclear sites, and we asked a couple different questions that to me illuminate the complexity of public opinion on anything like foreign policy. If I ask people for their view on healthcare, oftentimes that's pretty straightforward because people deal personally with the healthcare system a lot. Or if I ask a question about education, you'll get pretty informed views from a lot of people because they went through school themselves or they have kids in schools. But how many people have day to day experiences dealing with how do you stop Iran's nuclear program?
mhm.
And so public opinion on issues like that tends to be pretty complicated, at times contradictory. So when we asked people about the situation, we asked a couple different questions, one of which was just, what do you think the United States should do when it comes to the conflict in the Middle East? And we gave people four different options.
Mhm.
The options were we should just stay completely out of it. We gave them the option of we can stay involved, but purely in a diplomatic way. We offered you can get involved through diplomacy and through defending Israel. So we can shoot down rockets, we just can't shoot rockets of our own.
Mm,
And then finally, we should join through joining Israel in striking Iranian
right.
targets. And when you ask it in that way, only 8% of our respondents chose we should join Israel in striking Iranian military
Wow.
targets. You would think, well, that's a pretty big sign the public's not going to love this. On the other hand, we also then asked a sort of forced choice messaging question.
Right.
I had a couple people tweet at me that like, this question is leading. And I'm like, yes, both sides of it are leading. That's the point. I'm trying to see which side leads you harder.
Right.
The options we gave were Iran developing nuclear weapons would be an existential threat to the US and its allies and justifies US involvement in supporting Israel versus is Iran developing a nuclear weapon is concerning, but not worth the US getting involved in another Middle Eastern war. And when you ask it that way, by almost a 20-point margin, this justifies our involvement wins. So when you raise the specter of we cannot allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon, people are like, yeah, you're right. I get it. Okay. And only about a third are still like, nope, I don't care. I'm out on this. I don't want anything to do with it. But when it comes down to the specifics of what people want the US's
Yeah.
involvement to look like, that's where us directly striking Iran was not something voters were clamoring for beforehand. Now, I always think of Donald Trump as if you're ever like doing your dishes and there's like a pot in the sink that has a lot of oil in it, you put the dish soap in and all of a sudden all the oil like spreads out to the sides. Like
Mm,
that's exactly what Donald Trump is. Every time he does something, all of a sudden he's like the dish soap and everything spreads out to the sides. So
right.
suddenly people who were really anti-war before, but they're MAGA through and through, a lot of them came around to being like, you know what, this actually was the smartest presidential decision ever made.
Right.
And so on and so forth. So I suspect the polling on this will move into established partisan camps pretty quickly.
And so what do you think is the more effective of what's the more if in a month we have it in the expected camps, then is that data that's worthy, or do you actually learn more from the measurements you did sort of in the run up and in the immediate aftermath, because it is when people were a little bit more fluid in their thinking? Like, what gives you more insight on if you were trying to use the data to make a decision on persuasion in a campaign?
I mean, I would be interested in seeing which groups shift the most. So,
Mm,
for instance, among Republicans, in our data, even before the strikes, we love to ask this question: do you think of yourself as a Trump supporter first and foremost, or
yep.
as a Republican Party supporter first and foremost? And I think the conventional wisdom is that if you are more of a Trumpy person than a party first person,
Yeah.
a more Nikki Haley type
By the way,
person, et
what's your
cetera,
breakdown these days inside the party? Like, because that ebbs and flows. It's been, we've done this. We've been doing, or I say we. I'm no longer running the NBC poll, but uh, when Trump was down, it would be 40-60 in favor of Republicans, and when Trump would be up, it would be essentially 60-40. I'm being estimate, but where are you? Where's your dial these days on that?
It's closer to 60-40. I want to get you the exact number because I don't want
Hmm.
to just guess, but I believe it was something like in the high 50s for
Hmm.
Trump first, and it
Hmm.
was in the maybe high 30s. Yes, okay. 56% supporter of Donald Trump,
Hmm.
37% supporter of the Republican Party. 3%, I don't really support either one, 3% unsure.
Hmm.
So it's still, and you're right, this is a number much more so than Republican just identification in general that has
Hmm.
moved around a ton. When he was in
It
exile
moves
in
very
Mar-a-Lago,
fluid. Yeah.
there was a time when it was only like 1 in 4 Republicans still thought of themselves as like diehard Trump people. But the more he is in the news, the more Republicans rally around him, the more they think of him as the person they rally around.
Hmm. So, is it your mindset that Iran is still, would you call it unsettled data right
Yes,
now?
and I think the intelligence estimates of what did we actually achieve. I
Hmm.
think there's a reason why Donald Trump is so angry about that report from earlier this week
Right.
that the Defense Intelligence Agency says maybe actually not that much damage was done, because the whole purpose of doing this is that you have addressed in that question where people were getting messaging, you have addressed the existential threat. If you have not addressed the existential threat, then what was the point?
This will flip
And
upside down on.
so
Yeah.
that's why I think
Mhm.
the polling on this is all going to hinge on what did we actually achieve there.
Right. So let's go to our this fun little like I said, summer Christmas gift for data geeks that came out from Pew. And sort of uh it's easily the most granular. It's basically the best version of an exit poll as you can get. Um I thought most of mainstream media got the wrong headline. The headline, and I thought Pew led with the wrong thing, right? Their headline was simply, "Hey, a higher turnout would have benefited Trump more than it would have benefited Harris," and I didn't think that was a new insight. I feel like that we kind of we've known this
Yeah.
for a couple of cycles now. For me, the biggest headline is the Hispanic number, the
Yeah.
5148. Like that is the oh wow type of result. I mean, we knew it was closer. The question was, I don't think any of us thought it was that narrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The fact that the Trump coalition was made up of, you know, 22% voters who were not white is actually huge for a
It's
Republican
gigantic.
presidential candidate.
Gigantic.
Um, and I've been thinking a lot about where our politics were 10 years ago lately.
Hmm.
In part because it's been 10 years since Donald Trump went down the golden escalator.
Right.
It's been 10 years since I wrote my book about what Republicans should do to win back young voters that didn't mention Donald Trump and like exists in some parallel alternate universe where none of the
Yeah.
last 10 years ever happened.
Right.
But also, I think back a lot to that period of time where Republicans were in such a panic about their poor performance with working class voters, poor performance with
Right.
voters of color, poor performance with suburban voters, poor performance with younger
And
voters.
you're really referring to 2012. I mean, 2012 was the peak of all of that. Is that fair?
Yes, and you
Yeah.
had, in the aftermath of that, then you had the autopsy.
Right.
You then had Eric Cantor losing in the summer of 2014, and that kind
Hmm.
of being like, oh my gosh, not only is our party not moving back to the center, we now have this base that is putting seats at jeopardy by taking over primaries. I have thought a lot about that this week with regards to everything that happened in New York, but
My
it is
favorite
just
tweet, in
interesting
fact,
to
I quoted you. I used you earlier in a my monologue about how you were having flashbacks at the anonymous
yeah.
centrist Democrat who was going, well, we're going to nominate these crazy people who have crazy ideas, and then we're never going to get them done, and then voters are going to hate us even more. And it was like that was every Tea Party candidate, right, in 2014.
Yep. And every Republican strategist was panicking that we were never going to win elections again. And then we did. And that to me is the thing that has been the most surprising is someone like me 8 years ago was completely hair on fire that Donald
Yep.
Trump is going to take everything that our party has been doing to try to win over young voters or voters of color, and he is lighting it all on fire, and it is going to be unrecoverable. And now, if I am a person that follows the data, you cannot, you have to acknowledge that those are the very groups that he
Mhm.
put his reelection, he built it on those groups,
Yeah.
and it did better with Latino voters, better with younger voters than any Republican has in 20 years. And that's really remarkable.
It's funny you bring up 20 years ago because I did a little tweet on this that it is fascinating to me that at least on race and ethnicity, the 2024 election actually looks more like 2004 than any other election. It looks more like 2004 than any other election this century. And in
Mhm.
2004, George W. Bush was getting double digits support among African Americans. In 2004, whichever exit poll you want to believe, is it 44% of Latinos? I think we've now, I think, accepted the premise that it was 44%. Democrats kept saying,
Mhm.
"Oh, it was only 40." Okay, you want to have this fight? Like it was a lot. Um, and I've been trying to, now that doesn't mean the electorate, it's different by education than it was 20 years ago. But what do you make? Because there's a part of me that has believed that the Obama coalition was an outlier. The Obama coalition was special to Obama for a variety of reasons. And what's interesting to me is it's sort of like, did we go, this is what our electorate looked like pre-Obama, and it took essentially 10 years post-Obama to get back to what the electorate looked like pre-Obama. What do you make of that?
So I think there are a couple of things that are a little bit uh, that are still different today.
Mhm.
One is that you still see, I think you see younger people interacting with politics in a fundamentally different way today than they
Mhm.
did in 2004.
Mhm.
I also think, just the share of the electorate that is non-white has continued to grow, um, sort of separately from the ebbs and flows of an Obama presidency, maybe
Right.
turning out an especially high number of black voters or something like that, where that was supposed to be the death knell of the Republicans. That if Republicans could not figure out how to overcome a rising share of the electorate made up from the millennial generation or a rising share of the electorate made
Right.
up of Latinos, they were going to be washed out. And Republicans have figured some of that out. So I think it's not necessarily. I don't think we're fully back in 2004. I know the fashion that the kids these days are wearing is. I know the
Yeah.
music. I know we've like really gone back to
My
this kind of
18-year-old
early
likes Oasis. I'm like, Oasis? How did this
Oh,
happen?
that's good. It could be a
I
lot
know.
worse. That could be
It
a
could
lot
be.
worse.
It could be. But you're right. Like little late 90s, early aughts. Yeah. That's funny. Well, it's here was another thing though that I was wondering and looking through the data. When Democrats go about targeting and messaging, they actually think demographically all the time with their messaging, and they tell
Mhm.
you, right? They telegraph
Yeah.
it. This is how we're going to appeal to Latino voters, and this is how we're appealing to black voters, and we've got to appeal to black men, and we've got to appeal to this,
Mhm.
blah 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 blah. Um, I'll hear some of that on the Republican side of the aisle, but not nearly as much. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, are we overrating um like we make all these efforts to look at these splits when everything moved in the same direction. Like take black men.
Yeah.
There was this obsession, oh my God, she's doing terribly with black men. Well, what if I told you he also doubled his support among black women? So like my point is that this wasn't just a black male issue. This was just he doubled his support among black voters. Hard stop. He doubled it among black men and he doubled it among black women. And you see it across the board that there isn't I didn't find one individual demographic group that you say, oh, this is the explanation. When he basically improved across the board, which makes me think that the xylophone approach of the Democrats, which is we're going to message over on this to this group of people and on this to this group of people, was a complete and utter failure. And the message to everybody approach was more effective.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think going after voters in cities or like going after places where Democrats had made such inroads over the last 20 years that there
Mm-hmm.
was room for the tide to come back out
Mm-hmm.
was pretty smart. We took a look at counties, so
Mm-hmm.
not individual people, but counties demographically to see where the shift was. And when I give presentations to my clients or other audiences about what happened in 2024, I say everybody talks about how polarized we are as a country and how it feels like red and blue America are splitting further and further apart. What if I told you this was an election where we actually saw some of that polarization shrink? And people are like, what are you talking about? And it's like, yeah, did you know that actually urban voters, like urban counties, swung more to the right? And so therefore the distance in voting behavior between the center of a big city and the most rural county you can think of, like they are slightly less different in how they voted. Counties that are very diverse and counties that are super white voted a little more like one another this time. I mean, the fact that Donald Trump improved his numbers everywhere meant that like you didn't see the gender gap grow. If anything, you saw it shrink. You didn't see the age gap grow. If anything, you saw it shrink. And so you go through all of these demographics, and there isn't, in the only one where there was polarization that did get worse was a little bit like white college versus white non-college. But I mean, we're talking like 2 or 3 points if you're looking at the network exit polls.
Sure.
I mean, it's just, that's the only place where you may have seen some slight widening of the gap.
Well, to back up your urban point, and it is interesting that let's just take African-American voters. Hillary Clinton won them by 85 percentage points. Kamala Harris won them by 68. Like that's the swing. Like that was a swing, but these swings were across the board. It wasn't just Black voters. It was young voters. It was, and so if you were looking at this, would you say the Democratic Party had demographic issue, or would you say they have a messaging issue?
I would say it's a messaging issue first and foremost, because I am not yet convinced that all of those voters are Republican voters forever and ever and ever. If you look, one of the things that's so valuable about that Pew study is they can look at people who are validated voters in 2020 and in 2024, or people who didn't vote in one of those two elections, and sort of match up, how did people flow? And it's not the case that, that a bunch of people who voted for Joe Biden last time all swung to vote for Trump. Like some of them did, 5% of Biden's voters became Trump voters, but 3% of Trump's 2020 voters became Harris voters. So, there was a little bit of switching off there. To me, the bigger story is an awful lot of Biden 2020 voters just didn't vote.
That's the biggest story out of this. It's who didn't show up. Pure and simple.
Yeah, that's all. That's the whole game. And then of people who didn't vote in 2020, Trump did a little better among those folks. I mean, and that to me, the Democratic coalition just failing to excite and turn out people who had voted for Biden before, but this time said, I am not dealing with this. No, thank you. I'm not interested. Was really striking. I don't think that gives a clear answer, though, to the question of like, what should Democrats have done? Because again, to the idea that this is like a repeat of the Republican identity crisis of, a decade or 12 years ago, the question is, well, did those people not turn out because we were insufficiently progressive, because we tried too hard to win over those Liz Cheney Republicans, and we didn't, go far enough to the left on Gaza? Or is the problem that we went too far to the left on the woke stuff, that we went too far to the left on spending, and we got too captive by the progressives? And like Republicans went through the same thing. Is the problem that we were too conservative? Is the problem that we weren't conservative enough?
Well, nobody in 2013 would have said, the answer for Republicans to recover is to double down on immigration and get tougher. And yet that turned out to be the right call. Just politically. I'm not going to sit here. I'm not making a judgment about the policy, but politically, it turned out every instinct of the autopsy was exactly wrong.
Let me push back on that. Okay. So the instinct about immigration, to the extent that immigration is like the main thing people remember from the autopsy, you are right. That the politics of immigration over the intervening decade have changed a lot, where that is no longer, that clearly, in fact, the opposite is the way that you would go about winning Latino voters. But something that I think people don't really remember as much is that a lot of stuff in that autopsy were things like get better about meeting voters where they are, using data and digital to target them more effectively. Go find unconventional audiences. Go get more engaged in pop culture. And so weirdly, like I went back to reread that document not too long ago, and it actually holds up better than you'd think because weirdly, Donald Trump does a lot of those tactical things that don't sound as sexy as the party needs to moderate on immigration, the main thing people remember. He actually did a lot of it, and it finally, it bared fruit.
Let's look at the Mamdani victory in New York, and I'm curious because there's a bunch of ways you can look at it, right? This argument about should they have been more progressive, or was it something else? And thing is, I think it's too soon to know what the exact answer is because you can easily say, well, Mamdani was talking about the issues voters were talking about, which was cost of living. Sounds familiar. Trump was talking about the issues that voters are talking about, cost of living. And Cuomo was talking about Donald Trump. Kamala Harris was talking about Donald Trump, right? Like, it's possible that's the explanation. Again, I don't think we know the answer yet until we see more of this. If we see people trying to replicate Mamdani on policy, not just on tactics, but on democratic socialism, right? I am, because of the example of Donald Trump, I'm not going to sit here and say for sure that isn't going to work, given what we just discussed. Now, I look at what happened to the state of Florida when they introduced democratic socialism, and it turned a swing state into a red state literally in 6 years. So that's my example of why I assume this doesn't work. But I don't want to make those assumptions because, hey, Donald Trump upended the table. How do you see the result, and what do you think was what do you think people are overrating versus underrating, and what was impactful in that race?
I am very bullish on media savvy populists. Like I just right or left doesn't matter. I think people who understand how to communicate in the year 2025, who are really good at it, and who are willing to go and do things that don't feel so classically political, like the future is theirs.
Not staged, that anything that looks like it's a cookie cutter or like what you're supposed to do.
There was a video making the rounds of Mamdani going to halal carts and being like, make halal, was it $10 again or make it $8 again? That like, it was great. It was like produced it felt like it could have been produced by somebody doing like man on the street interviews for one of the late night comedy shows or something like that. Like it was entertaining to watch. I think if you are not entertaining, you are losing eyeballs in this media ecosystem. I think Donald Trump knows that.
Everything is infotainment, is what you're saying. We are the infotainment.
I mean, and I'm not saying that as like an indictment of the American voter. I think it's completely rational for people to be drawn to things that engage, that make them feel, that make them laugh, that make them cry. That's human nature. It's not just voters being dumb, like, oh, I wish we could just make them all read, The Economist every week. Like, no, let's be realistic here. Like content like that is really good. I have always been bullish on AOC for this very reason. I think she's excellent at this. I think her in her kitchen cooking while she's doing Instagram lives looks great. And not everyone can pull that off.
She does the video game and Twitch too.
Yes. Look, I think she's playing chess while everybody else is playing checkers.
She's a 5-star political athlete. I'm a college football fan in the star system. They're 4-star, 5-star. She's a 5-star. Now, I don't know if you win a national title with her. Okay. But I know she's probably going to be the most talented candidate running for president if she chooses to run. Doesn't mean she wins the nomination and doesn't mean she becomes president. But that still, I would argue, would mean she's probably the most talented political athlete that will be running.
Yes. And so I think to the extent that anybody is learning lessons from this, to me, it is less that voters are strongly ideological in one direction or another, but more that they will allow you to go ideological places they are not, so long as they feel like you actually care, that you actually give a damn, and that you're actually listening to someone like them. And the fact that you are creating content or messaging or the way you're speaking is not so far removed from them is in and of itself a signal that you care about them. And I mean, to the extent that then somebody like a Cuomo comes along, so deeply flawed, and comes in with this sense of like entitlement, like, oh yes, of course I was going to win this. I mean, how many times have we seen this where somebody feels entitled to a race and therefore completely misses the challenge that's coming to them? This is a tale as old as time.
The very first race I covered semi-professionally, Dick Thornburg. It was a Pennsylvania Senate race. Harris Wofford, Dick Thornburg. Dick Thornburg was George H.W. Bush's attorney general. They recruit him to be the nominee after John Hines dies. And they knew they were going to have this special election. And he's up 30 points in the first poll. Sound familiar? Andrew Cuomo was up, 30 or 40 points in the first poll. This sort of university, this college president, literally with the patches on his elbows, that guy's not going anywhere. Sure enough, Harris Wofford becomes a senator. The guys who work on Harris Wofford's campaign get hired by Bill Clinton. Those guys were guys named Jim Carville and Paul McGallis. So when you say it's as old as, literally, you see this and there's always a point where a party sort of starts to atrophy because they've been in power too long, right? And we were getting on the 12 years of Republican presidencies and all of that. So you could feel that's the one question I have to you, which is another question I have, which is about where we are in that. Do you think 2024 was a vote for an election, or was it a vote against election? Meaning that last group of voters that made the decision, were they voting for Trump or were they voting against the Democrats?
So I believe the exit polls suggested most Trump voters were voting for Trump, and that most Harris voters were voting against Trump. Like that this really did, to the extent that this was a referendum on Trump, like they kind of succeeded in making it a referendum on Trump. That just didn't pan out the way.
You think it was more of a referendum on Trump and not on Biden?
I suppose that's a good point, and I guess the question doesn't allow for the possibility that Biden was a factor, right? It's either, was it for Trump or against Harris, and Biden's not listed in that question. I mean, I definitely think that the Biden of it all, and the fact that we gave him a chance to govern, we gave him a chance to undo the chaos and the mayhem, and instead the control room was left empty, and so, I'm sure that was a massive factor here, but I just think it's interesting. I mean, most Trump voters report not going to the polls to be like, well, I don't really like this guy, but gosh, can you imagine Kamala Harris? Like that was a piece of his voter base, but something like 50, maybe almost 60% of Trump voters, I'll have to look this back up, I hate not knowing the exact number, said their vote was mostly for Trump.
I only asked that
let me throw another thing in there.
Yeah.
It could, if you want to make the argument this was an election against the status quo.
Right. Well, that's what the voters keep doing. When given a choice between continuation or trying a new direction, even if it's a previous direction, every time but twice this century, they've chosen a new direction. And do you see any evidence that that's going to change in 26 or 28 yet?
No. And that's why things that today sound completely insane, like Gavin Newsom being the Democratic nominee who then goes on to become president. Like, I don't dismiss those things that sound completely insane, because what would have sounded insane in 2020 or 2004 when George W. Bush was reelected, that a gentleman from Illinois named Barack Hussein Obama would be his successor. Like that would have sounded peak Iraq war era. That would have sounded insane. And yet it happened. And then if you would have said, you know what, who's going to follow Barack Obama as president? Donald freaking Trump. People would have said, you're insane. And then it happened. And so, what is the next most insane possibility? I'll give that at least a 10% chance of happening.
Right. Do you consider the electorate, where is the electorate stable and where is it unstable?
I think the electorate is pretty stable with regards to highly educated voters. I think Democrats own them and own them for a long time. I think the working class is up for grabs and will entirely hinge on how the economy is doing.
Really?
We had a poll finding recently that
are more up for grabs than maybe some people realize.
I think it all depends on does Trump do with the economy what he promised or not? We had a poll finding recently. We had asked a bunch of different questions about whether you supported or opposed tariffs on a wide range of different goods and services.
Mhm.
And we were looking at the Republican respondents and then breaking it out by college versus non-college. And I think the discourse around tariffs makes you think that it is non-college educated Republicans, these like working class Republicans, that they're the ones that are demanding that Donald Trump do something about a trade system that has been screwing the little guy for whatever. And yet they were the ones that were the least excited about a whole range of tariffs. And I was like, I went to my team. I was like, we have to double check and make sure that this is not like a coding error in the crosstabs or something. And they were like, no. And ultimately, what we then subsequently found out through other research, those are the folks who are the most hurt when the price of something at the store goes up 5%. Like they're not the ones. So this whole concept of like the working class and what drives them, I think this cost of living question is so massive. I think it's a huge piece of what happened in New York. And I think if there is failure on that front for Trump, a lot of those voters would be up for grabs again to the Democrats.
One of my favorite barometer questions that Bill McInturff and I are both obsessed with is the question about should government do more or should government do less? We think it's as good of a question to ask as direction of the country, because in many ways you sort of see it. And there's been a general pattern over the last, over a 20-year period, which is when Democrats are in power, a slight majority believe government's doing too much. And when Republicans are in power, a slight majority believe government should do more. This most recent CNN filing had 58% saying government should do more. I assumed some of that was Medicaid backlash, but I also wonder if Trump has changed the perception of what government should do with Republicans themselves. And so therefore, while independents and Democrats are sort of responding the same way they've been responding for 20 years on the question, that actually you now have that Donald Trump has changed the Republican electorate and Republican expectations that, hey, no. Small government isn't necessarily a good thing. You want strong government. And there are parts of government that you want to work in your benefit. Have you been able to see more evidence of that a rank and file Republican actually wants government more than they did
yes.
20 years ago? Yeah.
Yes. And there are two things going on here. First is this belief that, so the way that we've asked it in our echelon polling is it's not as elegant as yours, but ours is, which one do you agree with more? It is preferable to have bigger government providing more services or smaller government providing fewer services. And when we ask it that way, we still find among Republicans a sizable majority say smaller government providing fewer services. But if you look at just Republicans under 50, they're actually more likely to want that robust role for government. They're not as much here in the GOP for like the old libertarian, liberated government type reasons, which I think is interesting. The other thing that we've asked is a question where we only ask this of the Republicans in our survey, but we ask, which one do you agree with more? Businesses should be able to operate however they like as long as they do not break the law, versus businesses should be held accountable if they are too focused on being woke. So this is the when is it appropriate to use the power of the state to come after private business, which is something during the Mitt Romney job creators are great, get government out of the way of business, would have been unfathomable. By a 5-point margin, Republicans leaned toward that latter statement when we last asked it.
That's the state idea of Florida. Ron DeSantis has been governing this way, probably more so than any other Republican governor. And I keep thinking it's going to backlash on him, and it hasn't.
Now, there are certain things where we still find in that same survey, we asked a question about should companies be doing the E and ESG, right? ESG, environmental social governance, that's come under fire from Republicans. Actually, it's the social and governance part that Republicans get really fired up about. But they're really not so mad about a company that decides it wants to do green stuff or try to reduce less carbon. That one polls completely differently than the woke or social governance stuff.
You just should have, you just may have inadvertently sent a memo to environmental groups. Hey, don't link arms with the rest of the progressive social network. If you separate out, you might have a better chance of selling your message.
I mean, the polling among Republicans just looks completely different for those issues.
That's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about the state of polling. And I look at it more as methodology. Look, I actually think polling's pretty good because I'm not looking for it to be pinpoint accuracy. I'm a trend person. I look for trend lines. That's why I hate Real Clear Politics and I hate Nate Silver in what they do with combining data. I think combining data, I think you take good data and bad data, it makes it all bad. I understand why it's easier to report on polling by just averaging everything out. But I'm one of those who believes a filet mignon and a pile of dog excrement is going to make everything taste like dog excrement. So I'm being very polite here, even though in a podcast world, right, we can say what we want. So I kind of view the state of polling as generally, if you're a good consumer of it, there's good stuff out there, but there's a lot of crap that's putting out there. But I think most of it is due to what kind of methodology you choose to use in your poll. So that is what I'm curious about. What is the best? You got to do a 20. I'm going to say, first of all, if you want to do a nationwide sample that you're comfortable with, how many respondents do you want these days?
So we do 1,000, and I'm still okay with that because of the special echelon magic that we use.
And having voter file and starting with using a voter file?
Yes, that's to me, that's for anything that's going to be political, you have to do that. But
so
that's just the beginning.
With 1,000. You're comfortable with 1,000. I only say that because that means you're only going to have at best, 180 Latinos, right? And that to me, it's the subsamples that become problematic if you want to look at them.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because then things get really noisy. And so what you can't do as much of is say, oh man, from month to month to month, Republicans under 50 have moved X, Y, and Z, because the margin of error on that subsample is so massive as to make it unusable. Right. So you're right. I mean, in an ideal world, I love to have 2,000, but I think just for getting like a pulse of the country, I'm still okay with 1,000 as long as let me put it this way. I'd rather have 1,000 that is really well executed, that we have invested in, rather than just taken like the cheapest available sampling methods.
The Survey Monkey idea, which is they do 19,000, right? But it's probably
I'd much rather have 1,000 good interviews than 2,000 questionable.
Gotcha. And I'm not trying to make you pick on Survey Monkey, and I will let.
Oh no.
Not. I say this with love. John Cohen's. I know he's a good statistician on there. I'm just not as. I'm a little squirrely on opt-in surveys in general. I feel like opt-in surveys can. What I mean by that was just you voluntarily, conduct a survey, and I just think that has an inherent bias to it. People that are willing to do now, I guess anybody willing to do a survey, there's going to be some bias, but that's why I get a little nervous about that. All right, so we've established if it's a good voter file driven sample, you're good with 1,000. Now, how do you contact those 1,000? What's the best way to contact 1,000? And are you a mixed mode person, meaning some phone, some text, some this, or is there one mode you can use to do it and still get a good sample?
So I still think that you can use opt-in as long as you do a lot of things to keep out the bots, the professional survey takers so we do things like we flag IP addresses that keep, or if we flag when somebody's using a VPN. It doesn't mean I think they're always excluded, but their like interview comes under more scrutiny.
Harder to verify if it's a VPN, right? That for sure what geolocation they're at, right?
Right. There's a question that Pew, I think, added to some of their surveys that we've started adding, which is, are you certified to operate something class submarine? And like, if you answer yes, you are removed from the survey because there's like 20 people on Earth. So sorry, our sample is biased against submarine captains.
Oh, interesting. But, is it a way to find out if you have a liar in your survey? Is that the idea?
Yeah, well, it's either a liar or someone who's just not paying attention and they're just like clicking yes to everything, which we can also do because we look at the average length of time people take the survey, and we can lop off the interviews that are at the like fastest end of that.
Right.
We ask open ends, and most of the time when we're asking open ends now, it's not because I just want the data. I mean, I love a good open end, but it's also, you can very clearly find going through that the people who are like just putting nonsense in to just like get through the survey to get their gift card or whatever.
Right.
So we do all of those things. The thing that's scary, so we every summer there's a conference called APOR. It's all the pollsters come together and they
Yeah.
all panic about all the things that are wrong in our industry. And this
Right.
year the big panic is generative AI and what it's going to mean for our industry. Because right
Mm.
now there are lots of ways I can use these tools to help me analyze a data set, but the bots are coming and they're getting better. The bots are going to
Mm.
learn, stop checking yes to the submarine question. The bots are going to learn.
So you are
Um,
nervous that we could have surveys totally, essentially, poisoned by people with a AI army of survey bots.
and this was, I made a joke on Twitter this past week because an article came out in The Atlantic that kids are starting to get landline phones again, that like parents who don't want to give their kids a
I
smartphone are
saw
putting
that.
a landline in their room. And I was like, it's like in The Lord of the Rings, like when Gandalf comes back and they're like,
Right.
you're back, you're here to help us fight the AI orcs that are coming for us. Thank you,
Well, I mean, not
landlines.
to,
Welcome back to
well,
the battlefield.
don't forget Bin Laden didn't use a cell phone for a reason, right? Like he was using old-fashioned couriers and passing pieces of paper. I mean, it is a it is you know, the more wired we become, the more old technologies are going to be secure.
Yeah. And so there's always this push and pull with new technology. It makes it easier for me as a pollster to find you, and it makes it easier for you as a respondent
Mhm.
to evade me and lie to me. And so there's always that push and pull. And I guess the worry is then when you have generative AI taking over as the
Mhm.
respondent, what are the consequences then? One of the things that's really hot in the industry these days is like a synthetic population, that you basically
Mhm.
use AI to say, generate for me a data set of what 1,000 New York City voters would be. And it can kind of do it. What I don't love about it is like, what is your training data? Is your training data a poll? Then just do the poll. Like, why are we doing a poll to
But
train a
wasn't
data
all the New
set?
York City polling off because
Yes.
they were using the 2021 electorate, and it turned out the 2021 electorate was radically different than the 2025 electorate.
Yeah, that was, I mean, I polling an RCV race is hard, but it like the first round was just so off on so many of those polls.
Mhm.
Just methodologically, the message that my research analyst who went to APOR came back with was like, when it comes to AI, this is like what they used to say about it, like if you encounter a bear in the woods, like you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the people you're with. Like just
Yeah.
make your survey better than your competitors, and the AI bots will flood to your competitors' survey if you make the barrier for them to complete yours high enough, like they won't
Mhm.
bother. So you just have to make your survey extra airtight so that the bots go elsewhere because it's not worth it to try to solve your survey.
Do you get any do you feel like you get any insight by averaging of polls that are of different methodologies and different, or do you think it can be misleading?
I don't mind it. I do appreciate when pollsters try to weight polls on the basis of past accuracy. So,
Mhm.
taking something that in the past has not had a good track record and saying we're only going to count this X percentage,
Mhm.
I think that makes it a little bit better. What I also like about it is that typically those averages don't ping pong around as much. Like something that always drives me crazy, and I assume this may
But
have
don't
driven
you
you
worry
crazy
that
too.
you're gonna miss something? I always worry that if you level everything out, then you may miss something because you've averaged out an outlier that actually was going to provide insight to an
Well, I think
electorate that might be moving.
I wouldn't use only the average to tell
Mhm.
me the story. So like for instance, Echelon's last poll that we did in Pennsylvania in 2024 had Trump
Mhm.
up by a couple of points. And there were not a ton of public polls showing Trump
Right.
up by a couple of points. I called up one of my other Republican pollster friends who
Yeah.
was in contact with the campaign. I was like, is this insane? Is our number crazy?
Mhm.
Because this is not what the averages are showing. But when you do what we do, like sometimes you just have to put a number out there and you think either I'm an outlier and I'm going to look like a moron or we're going to look like a genius in the end. But
Mhm.
you just have to go with what it says. But I don't mind the averages insofar as I think sometimes outliers happen and they create an enormous amount of panic that if you were looking at it in the context of like, what does the other data say, you would know this looks very different. So like the Seltzer poll is kind of
Sure.
another example, right? Like that was way outside of what any other
But it was
average
good
was
that she
showing.
released it. She could have not
It was
released
good
it.
that she released it. I will
Right.
always defend that she released it and was
Right.
transparent about her methodology, because then
Right.
someone like me could go in and go, "You're not waiting on education? Oh, okay. No, never mind. No, thank you." And like, but at least I
Right.
knew that.
Right.
And that transparency is very important. But having other polls out there that were averaged together meant that I could very quickly see like what's the consensus view versus this outlier, and now
Right.
I can make my judgment accordingly. So I don't
Um,
mind it. I don't mind it as much as you.
yeah, no, here's where I think on a national level, it's okay because there's enough diverse surveys nationally. Where it's a real problem is in the states because, you have certain cheap pollsters, right, who are just churning out, you know, rented day, rented time with YouGov or rented time with other some sort of warehouse of a data warehouse, right? Of maybe what do you call a panelist,
Mm-hmm.
one of those panels, and you can just churn out a bunch of data, and then all of a sudden one pollster has like 2/3 of all the polling for that state, right?
Yeah.
And then it sort of can mess up. I just feel like it really is misleading on the state by state level. It's I can accept the premise that there are times that it can be helpful on the national level, but I've noticed some people try to then combine subgroups and then try to
Oh,
average out subgroups, which seems like a total um,
nope, nope. That should have
disastrous
warning
idea.
labels applied to
Yes,
it.
yes. Let me close with this because you've been, I would argue, you sort of made your mark at first being sort of an expert at millennial public opinion. Um, is 2028 going to be the first election where millennials outnumber boomers in the electorate?
Oh, that's a good question. I it'll be
Yeah, we're
close.
getting
We
close.
are a very large
Yes, you're going to
generation,
be the
and
large.
as we have entered
Yeah,
middle age, we've
welcome.
begun behaving like middle-aged people. We are voting in pretty high numbers. Reddit has accepted that I have entered middle age. It has started feeding me lots of like r/lawn care
Yeah.
content. Like Reddit really thinks I'm a middle aged dad at this point. Lots of motorsports, lawn care, you name it. I digress. Yeah, I mean,
I
this
get
is one
AARP
where
crap now. So just so you know, this is what
hey, they
life is
are. I
like
do
as a
survey
Gen
work for
Xer.
them. They're
This is life
fantastic.
as a
But
Gen
I've told them
Xer.
don't mail me that card at 50.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they do.
I don't
And then
want
they
your
mail
card.
you and mail you and mail you. Anyway.
Yeah, the when you look at the data, millennials are still, on the one hand, they have moved to the right from where they were during their Obama
Well,
youth.
they started so liberal, they only had one direct. I would argue there was only one direction for
Yes,
them to go, right? Yeah.
but they are still more democratic
Right.
than the Gen Xers who came before them. And Gen Z is still a really big wild card because
Mhm.
Gen Z, obviously, especially Gen Z men, began to really gravitate toward Donald Trump. Like they are the ones whose
Mhm.
political views are more that like malleable, where millennials
Right.
were a decade or a decade and a half ago. That's where Gen Z is right now. They're much
Right.
more malleable. But I have not seen a great deal of evidence that Gen Z is more traditionally ideologically conservative. And so
Are
this
there
is
two Gen
where,
Zs right now? There's sort of because look,
yeah,
I mean, this data has been very compelling that I've seen, and I'm really into it because I have my household was a Gen Z focus group. It was very fun as a political nerd, right? I have a 21-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old son, and they very much have the influences and what they do, and they fit the stereotype for better or for worse in many ways. But there is a distinct, in fact, I've been showing my son some of this data, and I'm like, does this make sense to you? Where 18 to 21-year-olds are politically versus Gen Z folks that are essentially older than 21. And what it really is, did you experience COVID at home or did you experience COVID in college or above? And it does seem as if that's the line because both of my kids experienced COVID at home, right? High school, middle school. But there was older Gen Z experienced it college and even in young. And that seems to be where the dividing line is right now.
yeah.
You think that holds?
I think so. I think it's going to have ripple effects for a long time to come. Depends on how we're defining holds, but there is a great writer about Gen Z. Her name's Rachel Genfaza. She has I think, a Substack called The Up and Up, and it is, she has really been the person that has posited this as, when we think about Gen Z as a whole group, we're missing that there is this dividing line, and it is exactly what you're talking about. It is, what was your experience of COVID? Was it you were already out on your own? Maybe you were in college, you were navigating it as an independent adult, versus I didn't have a prom. I didn't have a high school graduation. I was unable to go hang out with friends in person for some of the most arguably important years of my life to do that. So I think you're completely right. But I don't know what the political implications of that for a long time to come, except I imagine it will leave some lingering skepticism about trust in institutions and trust in others. That's one of the things that I think makes me the most worried about our country for the future, and sort of sad for younger generations, is in order for society to function, you need high social trust. You need high numbers of people believing that if they drop their wallet on the street, someone's going to return it to them. You need high numbers of people believing that you can generally count on other people to do the right thing. It's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to be on guard. But if society overwhelmingly believes people cannot be trusted to do the right thing, things start to really break down. And that is where a lot of Gen Z is at, that they kind of think you cannot trust other people to do the right thing. The world is a dark and scary place. And that has a lot of second and third order effects that make me very nervous.
Boomers were more evenly divided than we thought, right? It's a very 50-50 generation over, if you look at it through a longer lens. Do you concur with that?
Yeah, I feel like I recall a lot of polls, both in the 2020 election as well as this one, where the Obama era. To your earlier point from when we started talking, that was the Obama era the abnormality? You had huge generational differences there, where you had boomers massively anti-Obama in some ways, and you had young people massively pro-Obama. And then when it becomes Trump and Biden, some of that kind of levels out. Right. And boomers who did not like Obama suddenly liked Biden, or their previous more progressive viewpoints began to come back out. Where for younger people, they went the other way.
How important? Last question. I'm gonna get you out on this because I'm obsessed with generations. How important do you think? Let me just put it in this form. So I'm Gen X. I'm right in the middle of Gen X. Okay. I am smack dab in the middle. There's no gray area for me, born in the early 70s. And my coming of age was Reagan. That's what I always say, right? Meaning, Reagan was the first celebrated president of our awareness. I certainly was aware of Carter, but Reagan was it. For millennials, arguably, it's Bill Clinton, right? That is and for boomers, it's sort of broken in two, right? You have older boomers, it was Eisenhower. Younger boomers, it's Kennedy, Johnson. I'm curious, how much is that first impression? It feels, how sticky is politics in your 20s versus your 60s? Meaning, if you're sort of leaning left in your 20s, are you always going to be, is there enough data now to prove that you're probably going to stay that way? Yeah, you may vacillate a little bit, right? You may move a little bit, but for the most part, you're going to stay sort of in that one quadrant. And I wonder just how much that is just of who was your president, was there a successful president or an unsuccessful president in your coming of age period? And was that the influential moment? Is there enough scholarship there to sort of draw some conclusions?
Yeah, there's a number of different studies that suggest things that happen to you when you are younger I think there was the one study I used to cite all the time. It was 3 to 4 times as much effect on your lifetime political behavior from something that happens in your 20s versus something that happens in your 40s. By the time you've reached your 40s, your worldview is pretty set at that point. Right. You can still change your mind, but it's much more established than when you're 20. But I think it's the finding was that less around presidents and more around events. So I would argue that for millennials, the formative things are less Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and more 9/11 financial crisis, Iraq war. For Gen Z, it's going to be less like Joe Biden and more Black Lives Matter, COVID,
And Trump. I mean, Trump
and,
will always be
I
a
think
part of it.
Trump,
Yeah.
I think, exists
Yeah.
as an event in addition to being
Yes.
a president.
No. He's bigger than, look, he's the most influential president culturally since FDR.
Yeah.
I really, when
So
you really now
I
look at it.
think you are
Yeah.
right. And I think this affects the way that Gen Z thinks about how politics ought to be conducted, which is
Mhm.
why I think this like populist, aggressive, not playing by the like traditional rules of communication approach, that is just all Gen Z has ever known. So to them, like, of course that makes sense of how
Mm.
that's how you should communicate. That's how everything is communicated. Politics is combat.
Um, Kristen Soltis Anderson, I always learn every time I talk to you, I learn something. And I could keep going. We went literally an hour,
Well, I
and
have been learning from you for a decade and a half. So
well, it is. And I hope folks, or do you do a Substack, or is it just Ruffini, your business partner, that does?
So I have a Substack, and I mostly use it so I'm a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. When I
Yes.
have an idea that is too weird or off the wall for them, it goes to my Substack.
That's how I've decided to use Substack. I'm like, no, I'm just going to do it. I don't want some editor deciding whether this is worthy of publishing. I will decide. So that's fun.
Yep.
Well, anyway, if you weren't I hope if folks weren't familiar with you, they are now, and they will only want to get more insight from you all the time. Kristen, this was a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck.